our ultimate goal is to help people take a step into faith exploration. Um, our whole thing around uh, the podcast is like we always talk about being friends at the pub, friends at a virtual pub, friends around a pub table. That's the kind of aesthetic we're hoping for and the kind of conversation we're hoping for. So less kind of interview, more friends like jumping in and cutting in. And again, it's back to that thing around podcasting be the messaging of podcasting be that is that you have friends. So we want to feel like you have friends. We want to actually be engaging with people as friends. Um, so as you're thinking about podcasting, and some of you are making podcasts now or thinking about it, I think as you're thinking about podcasts, I think about podcasts as a spiritual community. So another church plant or pioneering project, another, you know, another third space or a new place for new people. So the question I would ask anyone who's thinking about podcasting is the same question I would ask anyone who's thinking about starting a new ministry at church or a new pioneering community or fresh expression or whatever you want to call it, which is why do you, as the podcaster, and excuse me for being sort of a little irreverent here, why do you give a damn about this stuff? Like, what is the subject? What subject are you that interested in that you think you have something to offer or learn or both, and to be able to talk about consistently week in, week out, or month in, month out? What do you care about? There's this great old quote from a guy, American writer called Frederick Buechner, about your vocation being the place where your greatest passion intersects with the world's greatest need. And I think that's sort of it's old kind of chestnut of a thing, but I think it's just still a really good metric. What do you care about, and what does the world need that you think? And that is your sweet spot for new places, for new people, for any kind of new community. You have to care about it, and the world has to care about it. The interesting thing about podcasts is that you can find people, you can find a niche that you can have a niche kind of conversation, and you might be able to find enough people around the world where you could never do it in London or Lincolnshire, but you could do it globally or across the country. Say you want to talk about the spirituality of, I don't know, garden gnomes, that's probably not something I'd be interested in, but I bet you could find some garden gnome enthusiasts who have like a whole collection. So like that's possible in the podcasting realm just because of the scale. Scale's the thing we can talk about later if we want to too. So that's Hope and Anchor. That's our sort of reason for being. We're trying to, in terms of audiences, reach unaffiliated folks. And for us, that's a real target. And for us, unaffiliated means people who are not part of traditional religious community. Those might, and that description is not monolithic. So unaffiliated folks might be spiritual but not religious folks, or atheists or agnostics. They also may be kind of disenchanted Christians or disenchanted Muslims or Jews. But we're really, really thinking about primarily unaffiliated folks who are secular and younger. So there's all kinds of communities to reach. We try to do more around conversations that will be most interesting to people who are not, how do I say this in a pastoral way? I think there's space in Christian spiritual podcasting for doing work with people who have been wounded by church and that kind of repair work and sort of post-evangelical deconstruction. I think that's great. Hope and Anchor is not really about that. That might touch in, but we're more interested in doing sort of constructive spiritual searching with people who don't have a frame of reference at all, or who have a little bit of a reference. So we're not going to be talking about some of the things that like post-evangelical podcasts are talking about. Those are great podcasts, but we're talking more about like super constructive. It's not really about what the church has done to hurt us or wound us and to rebuild that back up, though that's really important work. It's just a different kind of audience than we're looking for. And again, there's plenty of folks to go around. And we always say that in church planting. There's plenty of folks. There's 70 million folks in the UK and a lot of people globally. So, think carefully about the folks you want to try to reach. Yeah, I want to honor time. Let me just say about how we kind of engage in the podcast and what we're trying to do. again, that whole thing around podcast, the message of the podcast being you have friends. I think the podcast at its a podcast, our podcast, a podcast at its best is sort of accompanying people in life, right? Expecting that as they're listening, as they're engaging, wherever they're doing that, that they know they experience this podcast community as walking alongside them in the world, and this is the ideal, and that as they experience that conversation, they may see the world in a different place. So as they I imagine someone listening to Hope and Anchor as they're riding the the tube into work in London or riding the tractor in the fields, and like, just because of that engagement, thinking about whoever they see on the tube or whoever they see at the walking path gate in a different way, thinking about them as neighbor, thinking about them as conversation partner, that we might all show up differently in life because we have engaged and built friendships in this podcast. Again, that direct experience thing, I mean, that's something that I really really care about. So it's beyond telling people information about stuff. That's fine. That might be a news broadcast or a news podcast. Nothing wrong with that. But Hope and Anchor tries to be a kind of direct experience. Um, and then, yeah, I can say more about how Hope and Anchor got to be what it is, but I won't go into the details of that, except to say what we started as was 5 years ago in lockdown. We started as the year of prayer online Facebook meeting where we all got together and prayed 15 minutes once a week during lockdown. And at the end of that year, we were like, we have this time on a certain day of the week where people have been coming together. Maybe we should do a TV show. So we tried something, and it's just morphed over the years into what it is now. I think what I love about that, even though it's been messy and we've thought about it and built it and rebuilt it and challenged it and broken it down and asked for help when we didn't have it, was that we are trying to model what we hope ministers and lay leaders in our church will try to model, which is that you can try something, experiment, take a risk. There can be goodness and not goodness in it, and you have to keep iterating, and that is faithful. And you can do that actually in public. You don't have to have a finished product, though Hollywood may tell you differently and Ali may say something differently. I love that about Hope and Anchor podcast, is that it's trying to figure itself out as it goes along. And I think for the little niche that we're in, that's a good thing, because part of our work, in addition to the primary purpose, which is to gather unaffiliated folks in conversation about spirituality, we do want, as a podcast of the Methodist Church, sponsored by the Methodist Church, we want to model a way of being, not just for those who will do podcasts, but a model, a way of being church. And I mean that in a big, expansive way, to model that way for folks in every context. So even if you're doing church in rural Cumbria without a podcast, that you might think about, okay, how could we learn from Hope and Anchor? What have we learned by being part of the Hope and Anchor community that we might apply to like physical ministry and mission here? I'll say two more things, and then I'll shut up and pass over, and then we can ask. I think we're gonna do questions at the end, Ali. Is that right? Yeah, Q&A at the end. Um, the one thing I would say that's super, super, super important about podcasting that I think sometimes we can take for granted, and I don't mean that you have to be like a super, super, like super, I don't know, certificated, licensed podcast host to do a good podcast. I think obviously people do good podcasts who have no podcast training at all. I have not had any podcast training, but I think there's something about being a good and careful listener, being someone who is willing to ask good questions and ask deep questions and ask unexpected questions. This is what I think podcasts that I listen to make them better than others. I get bored by podcasts where it's just the same kind of information exchange or the same kind of storytelling back and forth. But if there's someone, and hopefully the whole community does this eventually, who's willing to sort of know when to sort of ask an unexpected question and to not know the answer to that. So sometimes I think podcasters are like asking questions they already know the answers to. So tell us about that new ministry you're doing. That can be great in an information podcast. But if you really want it to be a dialogue, then you, as the podcast host, you need not to know the answer of the question you're going to ask, because you want to be as surprised by it at the pub table as you want your listeners to. Um, the other thing is, if you begin to have any kind of listenership at all, and Hope and Anchor's listenership is quite tiny compared to some of the big spirituality podcasts, there is a weird thing that happens just because people hear you on their phones, that there is a kind of weird, I heard someone talking about it, I'm going to borrow their phrase, like a guru status thing that it's bizarro. Like I was at an award ceremony on Friday night, this past Friday night, with my co-host Jazz, who is like a superstar. But people were coming up and it's like, oh my God, I've heard you on the podcast. And like, I'm just a normal punter, y'all. Like I am just not that. I mean, I'm me. That's who I am. But like, there was this weird like pedestaling that was happening Friday. Now I don't take myself that seriously, thank God. But it's just weird. Like so, people expect you to have like wisdom. And I think I just if you're a clergy person or a lay leader, you might have done some of that work around boundaries and what it means to be pedestaled by someone. So I just think it makes us think about the power of our words and the responsibility we have, I think, as leaders, especially leaders of spiritual podcast, the responsibility we have to be, all the things we say, safe, interesting, non-shaming, all those things. It's something that I was like, oh gosh, I need to make sure I'm being really, really thoughtful. That doesn't mean I'm not taking a stand on things. That doesn't mean I'm sort of sanding down my particularity, but it's something I hadn't thought as much about until recently. That kind of guru status. Now, can you imagine if you had a million listeners, people might see you out or hear your voice or whatever. But I don't think that's going to be a problem for Hope and Anchor, at least in the next 10 years or so. But who knows? Ali might have some super special plans for that. But I'll stop there. That's my 20 minutes, and I hope that was uh, something at least to be a jumping off point for later.
Yeah, that was really helpful. We are going to wait to Q&A till the end, but I think probably easier to take Jen's question now, which I'll give to you, which is in the chat, because it's directly probably for you rather than for the whole conversation. So feel free to answer this and we'll cut into the Q&A time, not into Sam and Neil's time. The question was, how do you manage the tension as presumably you can't sustain the level of friendship with hundreds of people? How are you managing expectations, or is that not a problem? Or is it about signposting to manage expectations and just being honest? But I think that kind of comes into the guru question you were getting at the
Yeah, the
end as well.
pedestaling thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go on.
I mean, obviously, it's impossible to create. I can't manage, there's the whole thing around, Jen, you probably know, when your congregation gets larger than 150, you can't manage all of those, like there's no way. So you have to think about in a congregation, if you want it to grow beyond 150, you have to think about networks of accountability and lay leadership, all that kind of stuff. I think in podcasts, I mean, the scale is so significantly higher. If you have to let it go and trust that you're trying to create a sense of friendship where you do respond to people's questions, but it's not the same thing as like one-on-one friendship. It's just not. And I think that's something I need to keep reflecting on.
Cool.
But I think one of the questions that we've got for Hope and Anchor is how does the podcast eventually lead people to I was going to say real communities. That's my own mess there. But like, how does the podcast lead people to sort of find a community of real friendship? Like, oh, maybe find Wesley's Chapel or find this online community where you can actually go and meet people face to face and engage with them. I think that's part of our user journey stuff we're working on.
All right, we'll shift over to Sam and Neil. Let me just change the spotlight. Sam, you are ready to go whenever you want to.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Roberts and I'm the Communications Officer for the Sheffield Methodist District, and I'm co-host to our district podcast, which is called Faith, Hope and the Journey.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Neil Harland, so I'm the mission enabler for Sheffield District. When we were asked to come on here, Fidge said that she wanted us to talk about, in particular, about why a podcast. And I think probably my flippant answer, if I'm completely honest, is, well, everyone else is. So I think we ought to have a go as well. But actually, a key role of what we do as a district team is about modelling communications and trying to model, I suppose, excellence in communication for our churches and our circuits and our people, so that they can think about, well, what does that apply in the people that their church or local community is relating to. All the credit for this goes to Sam, because she's the professional and knows what she's talking about, and kicks the rest of us into shape. But there's so kind of thinking about branding, and we do a kind of a professionally produced district magazine a couple of times a year. We try to keep our social media and our website properly refreshed, and some people within the district have now had a bit of media training, and in that landscape of, well, actually, how do we speak to different people through different channels and in ways which make sense to them, then actually podcasting sits in as part of what we're doing there. The other part of where we came from in wanting to do the podcast was that during COVID, if you can remember back that time, and I should have given a trigger warning probably at that stage, but actually there was a lot of creativity within our circuits about different ways of engaging people devotionally sort of throughout the week, various kind of little YouTube thought for the day type things, and a lot of messaging that way that people could access at the time that was convenient for them, and from within their own home. And gradually over time, a lot of that, pretty much all of that, faded away, not because people weren't interested, but actually because those who had been trying to run that on top of everything else they were doing, the pressures of the person who's in the same room as you took over, and so that got squeezed out, even though that there were kind of still people trying to access that. So we felt that there was a void that needed stepping into, with the recognition, as we started to think about what we were wanting to do with the podcast and why we gave a damn about it, to use phrase words, that there's a couple of people in our audiences. One is about people who are already part of our churches, and there's stuff in there about testimony and helping people on their faith journey, but also recognizing that we would hopefully be speaking to people who wouldn't describe themselves as part of any of our churches, but actually potentially had some connection. Maybe they knew someone who was involved in a church, and really working on that sort of local newspaper type principle, that actually people would listen to our podcast because they were on it, or they knew someone who was on it, and then they would carry on listening because they actually enjoyed the listen. And so it would ripple out through layers of connection organically, and probably generally locally. That's just a little bit of a kind of a counter through an introduction, and I'll hand over to Sam to show us what it looks like in practice.
Yeah. So how we kind of pieced it together was, we tried to do like a similar format for each episode. So we had a standard intro, we recorded some listener feedback from a previous episode, then we would have a similar set of questions depending on who we were talking to, and then we'd throw in some random questions depending on how the conversation was going. Sometimes some questions just needed to be asked, and similar to what Trey was saying, it's not always a great idea to ask a question that you're definitely going to know the answer to. So I'm going to play you a clip of one. Now, this was towards the end of 3 days worth of recording for Neil and I. We were quite tired, but this one stuck in my head because I was just quite moved by the story. So this is just the first few minutes, but it does show kind of our format that we used.
Hello and welcome to Faith, Hope and the Journey, the podcast from Sheffield Methodist District. I'm Sam Roberts.
And I'm Neil Harland, and in this episode we'll be talking about local preaching.
Whether you are asking questions about life or spirituality, describe yourself as a Christian, or are actively involved in a church, we hope this podcast helps you on your journey. Welcome to episode 3 of Faith, Hope and the Journey. Thank you to everyone who has listened to the Peak Wesley Way and the Metal Methodist. We are so happy and thankful more than 200 people have taken the time to listen and share this podcast with their family, friends and followers on social media. Whether you are listening to this podcast series for the first time or have tuned in before, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it, or if you've been inspired to try something new, or if you have any questions, please do get in touch.
Since we released our last episode about pilgrimage, I've had a lot of conversations about pilgrimage with people, and it sparked a lot of thoughts and some really interesting conversations about the real depth of conversation that you can get when you're walking and you're talking together and you're discovering somewhere new, and the time and space that gives. Conversations about what it means for pilgrimage means for people with faith or people with no faith, and is that the same? Is that different? How do we make pilgrims inclusive? How do we meet particular needs? How do we keep pilgrimage affordable? They've been really fascinating discussions, and I'd happy to have any more. If you've got any other questions about the Peak Wesley Way or pilgrimage in general that you just sparked from last week's episode, then do get in touch. I'd love to have a chat.
Today we are joined by Debbie Evans. You are very welcome with us. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'm Debbie Evans. I'm actually a lay worker in the Barnsley Circuit for North West Church as a pastoral worker, and I am currently working through my local preacher training.
Jolly good. How did you become involved in Methodism in Barnsley?
So I'd always gone to the Methodist Church as a child up until I was 18. I went every Sunday, went through Sunday school. And then when I was 18, I went to do my nurse training and had to leave home. At that point, you had to move away and move into the nurses' homes. So I tended not to go then. I went now and again, but I didn't go as frequently, even though across the road from the hospital that I was training at, we had a big Methodist church. I just didn't really go. And that continued, I think, throughout my life. And then I moved to Barnsley in 1991, and when I got married in 1995, we got married in the Methodist Church at Wunwell. And I used to go now and again, coffee mornings. I lived next door to a lady who was a member there, but I didn't go regularly. And then in 2013, my father was diagnosed with cancer, which was a massive blow to us. I was 100 miles away from them, and I was a nurse. So they tended to want everything to go through me so I could explain it a bit easier to them. And so it was repeated phone calls from my mum. We've had a letter, we've got an appointment, what does this mean? And one Sunday, I just sat there, a couple of weeks, I think, after we'd had his diagnosis, and I just said to my husband, I'm going to church. And he sort of just looked at me and said, what? And I said, I'm going to church because I need to get away from my mum for a couple of hours. She can't contact me. You know where I am, but she can't get hold of me, and I just need to go. And so I went to Wunwell Methodist Church. It was a Sunday evening. And I think it was probably about the end of September 2013. And I've always found churches, chapels, cathedrals, very peaceful places. We used to go to Durham Cathedral a lot when I was at school, and I used to go with my dad regularly. We would sort of climb up the tower. And I've always found them peaceful places, but I just went, and it was such a revelation to me, that I just went back week after week after week, because I just found almost like an inner peace and just a sense of belonging and somewhere to be where I just didn't have to think about anything else. I could just sit. And it was just,
so that was
wonderful.
5 minutes.
It was the
So I know
best
that was
decision
quite
I've ever
a
made.
long time to sit and listen, but it kind of shows our format, but also just having that quite broad opening question of how did you come to find the Methodist Church? You just never quite know what people are going to say. And obviously Debbie went on to talk kind of more about what she's been doing and things, but that was just a bit of a flavour for you. kind of looking at some of the more technical sides of it, looking at the name and the logo, I love a design program called Canva. I'm sure a lot of you on here know all about it. So I thought, right, we need a new logo. But from having spent a few years trying to create a trusted brand around our name of the Sheffield Methodist District, I wanted to make sure that we had a logo that was very similar to that, so people would kind of be able to link the two together. So that's how we came up with the logo that's on the screen, and you can see our other one just in the corner as well on the PowerPoint, so you see the similarities there. And then the name, it was kind of, you know, we want people to be able to kind of, you know, normalize testimony, normalize sharing stories, and everybody has a different faith story to tell. We wanted to talk about hope and share things that people could really say, like, oh, actually, I could do that in my church. I really like that idea. And that was kind of around the whole point of focusing our interviews on ordinary members, not just necessarily, you know, picking people who, you know, are, you know, leaders of churches and things like that, but more around, you know, people who people can just relate to and are involved in projects that other people can do. And once we decided on the name, I then spent time doing a lot of Googling and searching on social media to make sure the name wasn't used by anybody else, to make sure there wasn't any hashtags used by other people that might be things that we don't want the Methodist Church linked to. So I spent a lot of time just making sure we could definitely use the name. And once we could, we were kind of up and running, spoke to other colleagues about kind of how they do it. We've got a colleague over in Yorkshire West, Emily, also works for Leeds Sanctuary, so she was really helpful. We hopped on Amazon, we bought a mic, we found some people who were willing to speak, and off we went. So me and Neil, as I say, we did 3 days worth of recording in person. But I think we've learned quite a lot from it, but we decided that we were going to do a double header, because I kind of look at it from a comms point of view, Neil looks at it from a missional point of view, and we kind of thought maybe a bit like daytime telly kind of vibe going on, thinking of potentially who some of our audience might be. Yeah, and off we went. We signed up to SoundCloud, shared it through an RSS feed. But then we also made it available on our district website as well. So for a lot of people, and certainly some people who we do speak to, they don't want to download a new app, they don't want to sign up to a new account, but they do trust the district website. So we thought if they could listen to it direct from there, then it kind of opened more possibilities. So here is where you can find us. But in terms of kind of what we've learned and kind of what advice we'd give, I would say if you're going to give it a go, then just try it, but allow your conversations to flow freely. It's good to have a little bit scripted. It's good to have an idea of the questions you might want to ask. However, sometimes conversation goes off on a completely different tangent. And you just have to ask some other questions. A big thing for me and Neil was you have to get used to hearing your own voice. In terms of when you listen back to it, you have to listen several times during the editing process. And then when you release it, you have to listen to it again. But once you've done it a few times, then you do very much get used to it. But also, if you don't get necessarily listeners straight away, we're up to so far, so first series, 10 episodes, we've had over 750 listens, which we really weren't expecting, and that's great for us. But we haven't released one for a few weeks now, but we've still got new listeners. We've still got people logging on and listen to stuff like from the beginning, from the middle, from the end. So actually, it's kind of a process. We're working out series 2 now, but I think even when that's released, we'll still have people listening to series 1. So don't be disheartened if you start off and you've only had a few listeners. People will still keep coming on board. Have I covered everything, Neil? Is there anything else
Yeah, I
thing
think
to say.
there's most things. I mean, I think that the one with Debbie is quite a good example of kind of the how we're trying to reach a couple of groups of people. So there's for people within the churches already kind of engaged in our churches, that the fact that Debbie's not a minister, and kind of guess kind of particularly from within Barnsley, that she's someone that a lot of people know. She's very approachable, as kind of came across there. So that real sense of trying to get away from aren't they amazing what they're doing over there to, oh, maybe I could do something a bit like that, and just kind of trying to kind of flip into the kind of for such a time as this, kind of what you call for type messaging, which is a lot of what we speak about, but also then from people who maybe have some sort of connection but wouldn't call themselves part of our churches. Just again, she's a nice example of how it's so down to earth, and she went to church for the first time to get away from her mum. was actually kind of, there's something, yeah, kind of that takes barriers away from that, and it was really nice that as we kind of, one of the things that came out through them was just how many people's faith journeys have waxed and waned, and that they've engaged with different flavors and shapes of churches along the way, and kind of in their life changes as a result of that. But that was quite helpful as well, and that we always include in there then there's always an invitation to get in touch with us, the team, and how you get from broadcasting to dialogue is really tricky, but there was always that invitation there. We would always give a how to get in touch with the church, the person that was speaking, or their church or their ministry, but also an address directly out to the listener as well, that there'd always be a prayer, which would be about praying for the person that we've been speaking with, but also then praying for the listener as well, be that they've been inspired to do something within their church, but also sort of when we were doing the one about warm welcome spaces, praying that anyone listening who needed to find a place to be, that they would find that place kind of within the next week, or whatever words kind of came at that moment. So kind of speaking directly to the listener as well as each other. I think that's probably enough of an introduction. I'll hand back to Ali to take us forward, I think.
Cool, thank you so much. I think we'll just go straight into Q&A. I'm just going to bring Trey back into the spotlight, which he has talked so much about. So well done. Cool, thank you so much for that, Sam and Neil. That was really, really helpful. And we dug into some practical stuff. So over to everyone. Feel free to either put your hands up if you've got questions, or put them in the comments, in the chat even. Can't remember what live streaming platform we're on today, but one of those ones. Feel free to ask technical questions. I can offer some support with technical questions, as can Sam. Yeah, so feel free to ask questions. I'm going to keep chatting in case we've got some. If not, excellent. Mal, I hope I've said your name right. Please feel free to, I'll add you to the spotlight. Please feel free to unmute yourself. You're muted at the moment, so.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Just two very practical things.
Yeah.
You mentioned you found a mic on Amazon. Could you say a bit more about, the technical side? What sort of equipment is helpful? What kind of minimum standards? That's one question.
Okay.
And then you mentioned a number of platforms that I personally am not familiar with and how you get on them. SoundCloud, Spotify, Amazon Mic, Music, Amazon Music, and iTunes. So it's something about what do you need and how do you get onto these different places?
Thanks so much, Emil. Sam, do you want to take a stab at those?
Yeah. So we'd been recommended a mic. I should have brought it with me. I'm in my office rather than at home today. So it's I can't think, it's a something blue. I can absolutely share the details with people. It was recommended to us. It just plugs into my laptop, And then we use a program called Audacity. So then the microphone records straight into my laptop. Audacity is free. And we save those files, and then we actually have a podcast editor as well. I couldn't quite fit the editing process into my hours as well as everything else. So we wanted a pro to go off and do that for us, and was definitely money well spent. In terms of how we then did it, so we signed ourselves up to SoundCloud, which helps us with our distribution. We did pay a fee for that. But that gives us what's called an RSS feed. So we provide those details to iTunes and Spotify, Amazon Music. So people can kind of pick it up on different platforms depending on what it is that they're used to listening to. So and then you can also then subscribe to those channels as well, so people would then know when we had a new episode out. But as I was saying, we all wanted to be able to. Sorry.
No, you're fine, absolutely fine. The mic, was it a Blue Yeti one? Just out of question.
Yes, that's it. Yes,
Great.
yeah, we've got Blue Yeti.
So if you Google Blue Yeti, you'll get you'll get that from reputable retailers. So whichever one you choose, don't want to tell you which one to buy from, but feel free to do that. And then just to like really simplify the process for those people that are relatively new to this. So you would record the podcast. Obviously, you'd plug your mics in to either a sound desk or a laptop, depending on which way you were going to go about it. And then you record that in, then you'd edit that, either send that away to someone, or you could edit in Audacity, which is a really simple editing profile. And if you go onto YouTube, you'll find tons of like how-to guides of how to edit, if that's what you chose to do. Then you save that as a file format, MP3 or WAV. That'll come out of Audacity, and then that's what you upload to SoundCloud, which is what Sam's saying. And then SoundCloud will send it to all your different chosen podcast platforms, which you would set up through SoundCloud. So essentially, it's a pretty straightforward process of record the audio, edit the audio, send the audio to SoundCloud, and SoundCloud does all the work and there's other options for that Buzzsprout, or there's other options, but I'll put those all in the chat when we're answering the next question. But essentially, that's the process. So record the audio through a mic, edit the audio, and then export the audio to WAV or MP3, and then upload the audio to SoundCloud. That's a really simple, straightforward way to get to that process.
I think the third thing that I would add into that on the technical stuff, I just look at Sam and she makes it happen. But I suppose with regard to thinking about the kind of the platforms that people listen to podcasts on, it's worth having a little bit of a listen around on those, I suppose, to actually get a sense of what you appreciate and you notice from different podcasts as well. It's like anything, you kind of do your research and get out there, and don't copy what's out there, but
be inspired by it. Cool. Trey, a question for you from David.
Yeah, sure.
For circuits and districts considering their own podcasts, what advice would you give in terms of being adventurous, but also ensuring the content is Methodist in nature? So I know that's something we've had loads of conversations about. So if you want to go for that.
I think the question I would ask, it was like, what do we mean by Methodist in nature? Because that can mean so many different things. The first thing I'd say, though, is just to be really clear before you strike out on this journey, go out on this journey. It's like, what's the goal? What are you trying to do? And like, if you think you should have a podcast because you just want to present the notices in a different way, that's fine, but that's probably not a podcast. That's like an audio book, and people can download that, but like, think about how you how you want to present this material or get at this conversation in a different way. Really think about that before you start. I spent 8 hours of my life in the month before conference recording the entire God for All strategic update onto an audiobook. That was a podcast in some sense, but it was not one that was anything more than me reading the report, and people listened that way. We know that they did, which is really interesting. They got that information. But a podcast, I think, should be, as Sam and Neil put out there, something dynamic. So if you're, being adventurous, I think goes back to the conversations you're having with different people. I would say keep it simple in terms of what you're trying to do in each episode. So pick 1 or 2 things instead of like, we're going to read all of our Methodist notices and get all of them in the course of an hour. Pick 1 or 2 kind of things that you want to get at, and then, do some scripting, a couple sentences, a paragraph on the kind of the entry point, what your kind of interpretation might be, or the setting of the stage from the circuit perspective, but then get into the conversation with a guest. I think what makes something Methodist in nature, that could be so many different things. Again, it's are you trying to reach more Methodists with the news of what the circuit's doing? Are you trying to reach people to pull them into Methodist discourse? These are all the kind of questions you'd want to put on that sort of design sheet.
Cool.
Yeah. I think just from the being adventurous thing, we always made it clear to the people that we were interviewing that they get a chance to listen back to the edit before it went out. So there was always that, if you think, oh, actually, I really shouldn't have said that in public, there would always be that.
Yeah, there's some protection there. And I think that's one of the joys of podcasting, as opposed to having a live conversation like recorded, is the ability to edit it down to make it concise, and the conversation flow is actually really helpful for allowing people to. I think the other thing I like learning, so I've been involved in Hope and Anchor from the start, and other podcasts as well. I think the first thing to say is being adventurous. It goes against my very nature, but being prepared is really important. To be adventurous, practicing, playing, investigating. You can't be adventurous without having the skills to be adventurous. Otherwise, you're just completely reckless. And the likelihood of that going right is low compared to being prepared and being adventurous. So, just hold that intention. Loads of people who are adventurous actually are really, really prepared and have the skills to do that. And so I think just recognizing in the early days, we were probably less adventurous than we are now, because we've got 2 to 3 series of in the bank that we know the mistakes we've made and we've rectified some of them. So I think just the danger with adventurous, sometimes we think we could do that without any preparation, but actually being adventurous requires more preparation than just turn up and deliver something. So
I think that's a really good shout. And someone asked a question about sermons. I think if your sermon is manuscript preaching, which is great if that works well for you, the podcast is just, that would just be an audiobook, right? But if your sermon is, some scripted material, some input, short input, but then an open question to your guest and a willingness to ask questions following on from her response, and a willingness to be asked questions yourself. I think it's that's what we're trying to create. It's got a real conversation. So not just like, Sam, what do you think about X? Oh, that's very good, Sam. Thank you so much. Sam, what do you think about X? And Sam responds, and I'm like, well, what do you really mean by that? Or gosh, that sounds problematic. Or oh, that makes me laugh. And you want Sam to be able to ask questions back to you. So I think that's what would it look like for preaching to look like that? That would be really, really amazing. I think fabulous. But other really questions to come.
Yeah, I think to pick up on some of that sermon question, yes, that is definitely an option to stick them online. My opinion is very similar to Trey's, in the sense of there's podcasts are for something different than just direct audio to the person. So as Trey says, an extension of the sermon, a conversation after about the sermon, kind of really aids the journey. And that's what you've heard from both of these groups of people, are it's a really good addition to stuff, but it isn't a sermon in and of itself. So just to kind of point that, Elena, I hope I said your name right, and I apologize if you haven't. please correct me. I'm going to add you in so you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, that was perfect pronunciation.
Thank you.
So you nailed it.
Thank you.
First of all, thanks so much to everyone who presented. You've been massively helpful. And on to my question. So I work at High Street Methodist Church in London.
Okay.
And so far, actually, we have been putting out our sermons,
Cool.
like somebody asked about this, as a podcast. So we're kind of familiar with the technical side of things.
Right.
But we have been lately kind of toying with the idea of doing more with it, as Trey said, kind of producing a more dynamic conversational podcast. But since we have been just releasing the sermons, our audience has been mostly internal. So our congregation, mostly people listen to the sermons who might have missed them or want to revisit the themes. So I suppose my question kind of relates to reach and growing an audience. So do you have any kind of advice, any tips for reaching an audience beyond your own immediate congregation and people related to your church already?
Okay, I'm going to go to you because this is our ever-growing struggle. So if you go first, then I'll go to the other side.
Who are you going to first?
You.
Me, yeah. We are learning slowly, Alina, about this. It's about having a very, very clear podcast title. That helps. And we actually feel like we might have made some mistakes with Hope and Anchor. Like we're actually thinking right now, do we need something that says more about like what's on the tin? So like Hope and Anchor is a great sounding pub name, but what is the podcast? So really naming it. So like, Journeys into the Jungian Subconscious is a really great podcast because it says what it is, like politics unfurled, So I think that would be name it in a way that reaches people that you want to reach, because people will be searching for podcasts online, and so name it well. I think who you have, this is something I think we're doing better now, who you have as your guest, if you want to reach unaffiliated folks and folks who are not already in your reach naturally, have folks on your show who are willing to lend their name and their followership to your podcast. And that doesn't need to be a celebrity. If you're a Methodist and you're trying to do a Methodist circuit thing, having the president of the conference, for example, on your podcast, and then having her share that, or having the youth president, or having the district reps. I mean, that kind of stuff increases followership, but you have to sort of get sort of buy-in for that before they're on the podcast. So we have I talk about sort of B-list celebrities. We're getting some wonderful B-list celebrities. I'm like I'm not even a celebrity, but so it's not to critique them, but folks who are not going to be on probably Radio 2 or on the show, TV shows, but who are in stuff, and they're happy to come on the podcast. But if they're not willing to sort of be tagged or to share the content, we don't get that kind of buy-in. When they've shared their content, when they've said, "Oh, I was on this great podcast," and linked to it, then we notice the listens and the joins and followership really increases. So I think just thinking about that in terms of who you invite, not just not only are they well known in public, but do they have a social media following? That's a real big deal. And I think Gen Y and Gen Z will get that more than like boomers and Gen X. You can have an influencer who you have no idea who they are in sort of British public, but they have a huge following across the world. So just thinking about that, those are two things I would say. I don't know, Sam and Neil, what you'd add, or Ali, what you'd add.
I think just from a local perspective, if you're thinking starting from local congregation perspective, have the conversation with a few members of your congregation, and what would work that they could think of people that they know beyond the church who they might say, "Oh, you've got to listen to this." So what would that mean in terms of how it frames and what it looks like, but also get their buy-in to not just relying on kind of the church as an organization to spread it, but actually individuals asking their friends and family and whatever to have a listen.
Yeah, and I think that's I've been involved in a few podcasts of like on a much more local, lower level than what we do with Hope and Anchor. And I think what we found is it tends to spread better when it's like personal to the person involved, and therefore there's a connection with that individual. Like moving away from celebrities into like people are more likely to like a photo or engage with my content. It was about me because they're friends with me, and so getting that level of engagement is what works at a really like low level way of getting people to move forward. The second thing I say, which you don't say very often, but it's true of podcasts, and I think we said it early doors. For me, the bigger the niche, the more successful your podcast might be. And I think that reverse engineers a lot of stuff we teach in digital, but in this setting works really well. So like there's loads of things going through booms right now, like running. Like I'm really into running, and there's loads of niche podcasts. Gen Z aren't drinking as much, therefore they're into health and wellness. Like there's a whole space you can jump on board of like connecting faith with that. And I think that's a really interesting journey we're finding as a team. Like there's a number of people in this conversation who are now engaged in really niche like podcasts around parenting and faith that are growing a community in a really, and so the numbers are lower, but the engagement level is much higher. And I think that's the question to ask is like, we can raise numbers, but if we can get engagement up as well, that's super helpful. So I think there's just a few tidbits for you to help you on. So
Yeah,
go
just
Sam
gonna say,
quickly. Yeah.
we launched our podcast, our first episode of the Metal Methodist, just because we knew he had such a big following and people know him from all over the place. So we said we'll basically go with our like big hitter and then kind of take it from there.
Love it.
Yeah, that's the one reason why we made it a district podcast rather than it belonging to a circuit. So in theory, we had a wider reach to have then circuits involved rather than it just coming from one area.
Cool. Thank you all so much for giving your time. Really appreciate the things that you shared and the thoughts that you've had. Thank you all so much for being involved and coming along and being part of the community. I hope you've enjoyed your lunchtime today. Some of you have eaten lunch and I've enjoyed watching you eat your lunch, and I'm very jealous. My scrambled egg in the microwave did not compare to Jen's sandwich, so I'm very jealous. It's good to see you all. I'll stick around for a minute or two before I disappear. If anyone's got any questions directly wants to answer, please feel free to stay. Otherwise, have a blessed day and we'll see you all on the other side. Bye.